All right, so we are going to talk about emerging adulthood. So this is a stage of not exactly childhood, not exactly adulthood, but sort of the in-between period when you are changing from a child into an adult. So, all right, so these are just some things we're going to talk about, and then let's get to the slide. Okay, so let's talk about the 5 features of emerging adulthood. Basically, changes in the lives of people living in developed countries shifted the notion of adulthood from like traditional theories to the recognition that there's a new life stage between adolescence and adulthood, and that we need to recognize that this stage is significant in the sense that there are differences in people's psychology as well as physiology. It's not just teenager and adult, but there is sort of an in-between stage where people are thinking and feeling differently, acting differently in life. Now, this stage is about ages 18 to 25. The end of emerging adulthood and the beginning of adulthood it's challenging to define that age range, but it's associated with major transitions such as getting out of high school, getting married, parenthood, job stability, etc. So it's that stage in between the dependence on your parents or your caretaker and then moving on to being an independent adult, that in-between time period, which is different for everybody, but generally we're talking ages 18 to 25. Okay, so the median age of marriage in the US is 29 right now, 28 for women, 30 for men. And the foundation for emerging adulthood was basically laid by 4 revolutionary changes that have taken place in like the 1960s and 1970s. The technology revolution, there's 4 of these, sexual revolution, the women's movement or feminism, and the youth movement. The technology revolution has resulted in a shift from a manufacturing economy to a knowledge economy. So we went from the Industrial Revolution to the world of the internet, manufacturing to knowledge. And this reflects an economy that's based on information, technology, and services. The economic shift of this sort of knowledge economy has resulted in most new jobs requiring a tertiary education, which is any education or training past high school. So if you have a high school degree, the chances of getting a job, a decent job with just a high school degree is practically impossible. It's not impossible, but it's hard. And even with an associate's or a bachelor's degree, it's very hard to get a job in this knowledge economy. So many jobs, I even had a friend who applied to become a McDonald's manager with a PhD back when the economy crashed in 2008, and she was competing with other PhDs for the job position, and that's a McDonald's manager. So in the economy, there's really a big expectation of having an advanced degree, or at least a degree of some kind past high school. Then we have the sexual revolution, and this was really inspired by the invention of birth control pill, and also it changed our sense of morality. Women can now focus on their career over having a child. You can put that off, which is why the age of marriage and having children is so much later. And then, of course, the 1960s became very sexually liberal and kind of started a movement towards sexual liberality. The feminist movement or the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s really expanded opportunities for young women. And research shows that today in every developed country, from like grade school, primary school through graduate school, girls are excelling over boys academically, which is unfortunate that the boys are not doing as well as they were before, but it's great that the girls are doing that well. So there are significantly more girls graduating college, high school, college, and getting advanced degrees than boys are. So I think we do have a problem where boys are falling behind in school, but on the other hand, it is fantastic that women are doing better and have more opportunities. And then you had the youth movement of the 60s and 70s. And this really saw young people rejecting traditional notions of adulthood, such as getting married, establishing a home, parenting, and they embraced independence, spontaneity, possibility, which was good in a sense, although it also contributed to the highest in history divorce rates that America has ever seen. So all of these revolutions had pros and cons to them, and they all contributed to creating this new stage of life that we call emerging adulthood. It used to be as soon as you graduated school or even in school, you got married and you immediately went from adolescent to adult, and there wasn't much of that in between stage. But now we've sort of expanded that ability to have an in between stage there, just like we created teenagehood. A few centuries ago, if you were 13, 14, 15 years old, you would have been married and having children. So you weren't even allowed an adolescence like we give kids nowadays. You're expected to be independent. So childhood has really been expanded. So we have sort of like, let me see what I have here. Okay, so this is the rise in median age of marriage, rise in tertiary education. Okay, so first let's talk about characteristics of emerging adulthood. So we have an age of identity exploration. Teenagers are able to try out like various possibilities before committing to what they're going to do in life, their course of action, especially in love, in work. And so although this begins in adolescence, like Erickson said, it actually continues into emerging adulthood. Then we have the age of instability. People are often moving from one residence to another. Americans especially move a lot. People in developed countries move a lot. They try different schools, different majors, different relationships, and so it is a very unstable time. It is a self-focused stage of life. They're learning what it means to make independent decisions and to be self-sufficient. And unfortunately, this is not happening in childhood and teenage years where it should be happening. Like I had a student who she asked what age should she allow her son to go to the local store. So there's like a store a half a mile away from the house. And she said he had to cross a major street in order to get to it, a major road with lots of cars. And so I said, well, it really depends on his experience. Have you practiced crossing roads with him? Have you explained how things work? Have you explained, the dangers and how to handle them? And she said, yeah, she thinks she's explained that well to him. And I said, well, in that case, 6, 7 years old, if it's a responsible kid. If it's not a responsible kid, you might wait until 8 or 9 or 10. But I mean, definitely, I would start at 5 years old teaching my kid how to walk down the street and cross roads. So if your kid by like 6 or 7 isn't able to handle this responsibility, then you really need to get on top of that and teach them. And she goes, oh, well, my son's 15. And I'm like, what? You don't trust your 15-year-old to cross a road by himself. I don't care if it's major or not. You don't trust How is your 15-year-old kid not capable of doing this? But this is so common nowadays, and I don't get it. I mean, I'm a 1980s kid, and I somehow was able to maintain my parents' attitude of, when I was a kid, 2 years old was young enough to go outside by yourself. Well, not by yourself, but with your siblings. With your siblings a few years older than you. And I still have that attitude. But, I mean, by 15 years old, and I was like, your kid, and she told me he wanted to join the military. I said, in less than 3 years, that kid is going to be risking his life in war, but he's not able to cross the street on his own. Do you have any idea what you're doing to that child? By 15 years old, he should be able to handle life by himself. By 10 years old, he should be able to do a lot of this stuff. So that's why this emerging adulthood has really become this self-focused stage where they have kids. I mean, you shouldn't be a kid in this age, but we have created a new stage of childhood because we're not allowing our children to make their own decisions. We're not teaching them to make decisions and to be self-sufficient. So anyhow, I'm going to move on because this is a big, like, issue that I have with our society today, and I could talk about it for the next 5 hours, so I will just go on to the next stage. So this is also an age of feeling in between, feeling like you are in transition. You're not an adult yet, you're not a child yet. And I did say this is 18 to 25, but I know people who are 30, 35 who don't feel like an adult. I think I felt like an adult probably around, I think 27 was when I all of a sudden realized, wow, I'm an adult. And people look at me like an adult, and people expect me to have the responsibilities of an adult, and you still feel like a child, but you're not. And it's kind of a weird feeling when you suddenly make that transition out of the emerging adulthood to adulthood stage. But I think even now, like I'm 39, and there's times when it's even weird for me to feel like an adult. However, my mom, she said that she never felt like that. She was just, even from a child, she can remember being like her parents took her to an orphanage, and they were thinking of adopting a child, and they asked her whether they should adopt the kid or not, and she said, no, I don't think you should. And so they didn't adopt the child because the decision my mom made, and my mom was 6 years old at the time. So her generation was expected to be responsible at a much earlier age than my generation, and my generation was expected to be responsible at a much earlier age than like the Generation Z. So and the millennials. So yeah, it's just an interesting changes in the generations. And then it is also an age of possibility where there's potential for dramatic change. So there's many different futures that remain possible because, you know, you're taught to have high hopes, high expectations, taught to have a lot of optimism. You can reinvent yourself. You can decide for yourself who you want to be. Now, this is not, I should point out, and I've pointed this out a little bit before, but I'll be blunt about it. This is a social construct. Not every person in history of the world who is 18 to 25 feels this way. Okay, this is a creation of the modern world. You know, centuries ago, you would have done what your parents did, and there weren't many dramatic possibilities for your life. But we are, and if you're in other countries today, you may not feel this way, and you may not. This stage doesn't even exist because you're expected to be responsible so much earlier. So there are definitely pluses to this, that, you know, we have time to figure out who we want to be. We can try all these different things, which is a wonderful thing. But on the other hand, it comes with the negatives of being less responsible, feeling less like an adult, which is kind of a painful feeling when you're expected to be responsible and yet you still feel like a child. So pros and cons. Okay, this is the rate of residential change in the past year depending on age. Okay, so you can see in like 15 to 20 years old, the chances of moving in the past year spike dramatically, and then we become more settled. Okay, so obviously this is like moving out of your parents' house, going to college, figuring out what you're going to do with your life. And this is, do you feel like you have reached adulthood? So the ones who say no, not a lot of them say no, okay? And the older you get, the less... actually, that's probably statistically insignificant, because it's weird that the older you get, the less you feel like you're an adult. But you can see that people who say yes, I feel like I've reached adulthood, that decreases dramatically. Okay? And then people who say kind of I do, kind of I don't, that's pretty high and then starts to decrease. Okay? And like I said, about 27, that's when, this is like 25. This is probably statistically insignificant too, but yeah, 27 was when I really felt like, wow, I'm an adult. So yeah, I guess a lot of people agree with me. All right, so cultural variations. Emerging adulthood is mostly found in developed countries, like I said, it varies by culture. So this pattern of development you see mostly in like Europe, the United States, some Asian countries, Australia, the westernized countries, developed countries, not just westernized, but developed countries. Europe really has the longest and most leisurely period of emerging adulthood compared to other countries, and it's also the location of the most affluent and egalitarian societies. The textbook says generous too, but Americans actually have the highest rate of volunteering and giving than any other country, so I'm not sure exactly why Europe is considered the most generous. And egalitarian, I think there's some issues there too. I know in the United States we view ourselves as a kind of a racist, non-egalitarian society at this point. But if you do look to see, like, for instance, where was the first official organization made with the goal of stopping slavery? That was in Pennsylvania. That was not in Europe. Americans had the big push to end slavery, and Europe, in England, for instance, they did end slavery before we did, but we had the big push to end it and lost many, many lives in order to do that. So I don't know. That's definitely that's a debatable statement that the textbook made. But anyhow, all right. So the focus of emerging adulthood in Western cultures is, of course, on individualism and self-development. In Asian countries that are collectivistic, though, while emerging adults do explore their identity and self-development, it's really to a lesser extent that is restricted by their obligations to their family and mainly to their parents. So there's a different flair to it. It does exist in every affluent country because you can afford to allow your child more time to explore. If you are broke, your child needs to get a job and become responsible. There is not time for all this messing around. But if your parents are wealthy, then you can do that. So if you have been in or are going to go through emerging adulthood, then you are one of the privileged, affluent people in this world. Even though you may not be the richest American, you are certainly richer than people in non-developed countries. So the focus, let's see, I talked about that. The nature of the stage of emerging adulthood also varies by culture. So the criterion for what we view as achieving adulthood varies by culture as well. In the United States and most of Europe, adulthood really comes when you're financially independent. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't really feel financially independent until 27. Let's see, I graduated with my master's degree when I was 25. And that's when I actually started teaching at VVC at 25, which was weird because most of my students were older than me. And then it's probably, I would say that financial independence is what started like triggering my brain to think like you're an adult. So we really, when we can pay our own bills, when we can buy our own groceries, that's when us Americans and Europeans feel like we're an adult. In Asian cultures, one of the most important criteria for achieving adulthood is being able to support your parents financially. So it's not that you're supporting yourself, but can you support yourself and your parents? And of course, that's the individual versus collectivistic sort of attitudes. Young people really experience emerging adulthood in many different ways, in part based on whether they attend college or they go to work right away, or whether their cultures like tolerate premarital sex and cohabitation. Many cultures look to whether you are married as an adult. If you're not married, you're not an adult. And subcultures are like this too. For instance, if you are a Christian male who is going to seminary school to become a pastor, you better get your butt married because you're not considered a responsible adult unless you have a wife to play piano in church. And so it's part of the subculture. And different cultures have different attitudes towards that. So emerging adulthood is not likely to be a part of the pattern of development in rural areas of developing countries as much, but it is becoming more widespread due to economic globalization in the urban areas of developing countries. So even in an affluent country like the United States or countries in Europe, there's going to be a big divide between rural countries or rural areas and urban areas, so the city and the country. In rural areas, even if you're affluent, usually you're raising animals, you're doing country stuff, you're hunting, whatever, and you expect your child to participate in it. So like I'm going through IVF right now and trying to have a kid, and I was talking to my mom. My mom and I own a farm together, and we were talking about what we need to do in order to make the farm safe for a toddler, because, you know, when I take my 1-year-old out with me to feed the cows, like, we need to make sure that she or he can't get trampled by a cow. So it's a very different sort of mindset you have when you live on a farm or in a rural area than people who are living in the city have. And obviously I expect as soon as my child can pick up a piece of hay, they're going to be helping me feed the animals. As soon as my child can grasp and udder, they're going to be helping to milk the goats. And as early as possible that they can take that over so I can sleep in, that is definitely happening. Well, I was going to say that's a joke, but it's not a joke. I'll just be honest, it's not a joke. All right, anyhow, and the length of emerging adulthood does vary in length and content, both within and between countries and the different subcultures, rural, urban, individualistic, collectivistic, so on. All right, so I guess I got ahead of my slide, so yeah. All right, so what physical changes are happening? I'll try to go through this fast because I think we all get it. So this is a stage with peak physical functioning in which the body is at its peak of health, strength, and vigor. So it's all downhill from your 20s. Typically, sports performance peaks at the 20s, which is likely because physical stamina and cardiac output are at their peak. We measure stamina in maximum oxygen uptake, or VO2 max, whereas cardiac output is measured as quantity of blood flow from the heart, and cardiac output peaks at 25, VO2 max peaks at the early 20s. You're less susceptible to be physically ill, more susceptible to be injured because you tend to do more and do more stupid things. However, lifestyle choices can undermine your health, such as poor nutrition, lack of sleep, and so on. So now I will say, don't be depressed that, you know, you're going to be 50, 60, 70, 80 and be in horrible health, because people who keep up an active lifestyle throughout their life, you can be 80 or 90 years old and still be functioning really well. There's a show on TV called Alaska's Last Frontier, and it's a family that homesteads in Alaska, and one of the dads on the show is, I think he's almost 80, and he's out riding horses and shooting grizzly bears, and I mean, he's in better shape at almost 80 than, you know, I was at 20. So it's not truly that life is all downhill from 20s, but a lot of people tend to not take care of themselves, and so that's a big part of it. Okay, sleep patterns. Sleep research has focused on college students in developing countries because it's much easier. You can give extra credit to college students to participate in your research projects. So college students get studied a lot. And they tend to have sleep patterns that impair their cognitive functioning and emotional well-being, which I bet does not surprise you. College students report having a delayed sleep phase syndrome, and this occurs when you accumulate a sleep debt during the week. So you're sleep deprived during the week, and then you try to alleviate it by sleeping in on the weekend and the holidays, which does not work very well. It does work a little bit, so you can do it, but you're much better off having a consistent pattern of sleep. So many college students report having sleep disturbances, and one reason is that emerging adults show a preference for going to bed late and getting up late. This is referred to as eveningness, or being a night owl, which is an easier way to say it. And factors that contribute to eveningness include partying and staying up late, or staying up all night, which it's hard to not to do as a college student when you have exams and stuff, but yeah, but it's problematic. So for young children and adults, their preference is going to bed and getting up early, and this is called morningness. And yeah, I've been there, done that, so I get it. So to have good sleep hygiene, or to have good sleep practices, you should follow a sleep schedule. Exercise, but don't exercise late in the evening because that causes adrenaline to be released. Limit caffeine and alcohol after, really like caffeine, they say don't have it after 2 o'clock p.m. And alcohol actually, it helps you to get to sleep, but it keeps you out of the deep sleep. So alcohol is not actually good for sleep. And then turn off all technology as soon as the sun goes down. TV, cell phone screens, all of those, because they emit a blue light which stimulates your brain to wake up. However, of course, most of you guys are not going to follow these recommendations, and I didn't when I was your age either. So I get it. All right, how is your brain developing? So it's a time of, emerging adulthood is a time of significant cognitive potential, but high mental health risk. So you have myelination, synaptic pruning, connection making continuing in the brains of emerging adults. And it never stops, it just slows down as we age. And then we have our gray matter, which is composed of neurons. That decreases, while white matter, the myelinated and non-myelinated connections between neurons, increases. And the reason why that's important is white matter is our ability to think creatively, to understand, to literally make connections between ideas, to think in a novel manner. So that's actually a great thing. It leads to greater processing speed, quicker thinking, more emotional self-control, things like that. Executive functioning peaks at about age 25. And which is probably also why we start to think of ourselves as an adult at around age 25. And new connections are being made between the prefrontal cortex, located in the front part of the frontal lobe, and parts of the lower brain involved in emotion and motivation. So prefrontal cortex is like your personality, and then the lower brain is your emotion and motivation. And so these connections lend themselves to greater self-control and emotional regulation. Due to the unusually rapid synaptic pruning of the gray matter, coupled with like environmental interactions, emerging adulthood is often the time period when mental disorders such as anxiety, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia are occurring. Okay, so yeah, so let's talk about some risk behaviors, since this is the time period when mental health is happening. So risk behaviors are peaking in emerging adulthood. And we've talked in the adolescence chapter about self-control, how it's lower at that age. And as we age, our ability to control ourselves increases. Okay. So we also have social control. Okay, and emerging adulthood is the lowest point of social control. So basically, we have a hard time controlling our own behaviors and emotions. And then we also don't feel as much pressure to conform. Like teenage years, very rebellious. And so we don't conform to the norms of those around us and what is expected, which can lead to a lot of risky behaviors. All right, so youth 16 to 24 have the highest rate of automobile accidents, injuries, various fatalities, also suicide, drunk driving, texting and driving, all those bad things. So this is the rate of car fatalities by age. And you can see men, you boys, have much higher rates of car accidents, which is why you pay more in car insurance, because you are more likely to crash your car. My brother-in-law has totaled 5 cars so far, I think, and he's 35 at this point. We were hoping he'd slow down a bit after 24, but he's still going strong. My sister's been in 1 car accident, and it wasn't her fault. All right, so substance use continues to remain high during emerging adulthood in our country and other countries too, but we'll just talk about ours. This includes marijuana use, binge drinking, which is 5 or more drinks in a row for men or 4 for women. Substance use is also high among emerging adults in other developed countries, Like I said, it's not just the United States, obviously. England has higher drinking rates, especially binge drinking, than America does. But America has higher rates than many other European countries that have maybe more healthy attitudes towards alcohol. So, like a lot of Americans and the English want to drink to get drunk, whereas like France just drinks because it's a nice thing to do. So, the attitude towards alcohol is very important. Higher rates of substance use could explain could be explained in terms of propensity and opportunity. Okay, propensity in this case is the motivation to behave deviantly or rebelliously, and when it's combined with the opportunity as a result of excessive, like unstructured socializing, substance use increases. Okay, so propensity is how rebellious are you? And then if you are allowed to hang out with friends in an unstructured way, then you are much more likely to use drugs and alcohol. So if you're a parent, especially if you have a rebellious kid, then you want to decrease as much as possible any unstructured socializing. So going to parties, just hanging out in the neighborhood, going to the mall. Now, if there is a dance at school, or if there is a field trip, or if there is a supervised party at a friend's house or something like that, that's structured socializing. Sports teams, things like that. Then, right, then those are less likely to give an opportunity to use substances. Having too much free time is also related to other types of deviant behavior, risk behaviors, and so on. Now, risk behaviors do decline as major life transitions such as marriage, parenthood, and full-time work evolve, because you don't freaking have the time to do all that crap. My mom tells the story of when her and my dad were just getting out of college, or maybe they were still in college, but they had 3 kids while in getting their bachelor's degree. And he ripped out of a parking lot once and, squealed the tires. And unfortunately, there was a cop right there, so he got pulled over and got a ticket for reckless driving or something like that, some sort of ticket. And he came home, and it's like this $400 ticket in the 80s, which was outrageous. And he's like, I realized that I can no longer behave like this. I have to behave like an adult because we can't afford to be paying for tickets. And it was just like this big change in him. That was like his transition from emerging adulthood to adult, was realizing that he has to feed his babies. He can't be messing around. So this is binge drinking and marijuana use. You can see as you get older, it decreases. And if they had a separate graph showing when these people got married or got a job, then you would see an even more dramatic decline in that. Okay, now resilience. This is the ability to overcome adverse environmental circumstances and to achieve healthy development despite the circumstances. Okay, so resilience is life could be crap, and yet somehow you have the ability to overcome what's going on and to become a healthy adult. And resilience is really promoted by several protective factors, such as high intelligence, having at least one caring adult in your life, a healthy school environment, having religious beliefs and practices, playing a musical instrument, being part of a club. So these are the 40 developmental assets that I have talked about before. So those are protective factors that promote resilience. And emerging adulthood allows a lot of people to turn their lives around in a more positive direction and really engage in experiences such as joining the military, exploring romantic relationships, attending college, developing like their own faith, establishing themselves at work. You're able to set realistic goals. You're able to develop more self-control. And emerging adults who do set realistic goals and become more dependable and have more self-control tend to be the ones who benefit the most from this sort of turning point opportunity in their lives. Okay. So, a lot of students come to me and tell me about their awful home life, and I really push for people to move out of their parents' home. I went away to college and stayed in a dorm, and my mom and I have a great relationship now at this point, but I think one of the reasons why we have such a good relationship is because I was able to move out of the house and be on my own and figure out who I was. And then I went and I traveled the world. This is terrible and you shouldn't do it, but it was the best decision of my life, so do what you want. But I took out student loans and I traveled everywhere. I went to Ireland and Scotland and France and, climbed the Eiffel Tower and all on student loan money. And it was great. It really helped me to figure out who I was. So I think if I had have stayed home and lived in my parents' house through college, I would not have had that opportunity to develop myself. So I really encourage, college age kids to get out of your parents' home and go live your life. And yes, it will be hard. And yes, you might be eating crackers to survive, but it's totally worth it. So anyhow, let's, what are we talking about next? I think I'll skip this. So this is just talking about going to college, earning a degree. Okay, it's hard to afford. I know, because I'm still paying my student loans. Of course, I use my loans to travel the world, so I guess I wouldn't owe quite as much if I had just paid for school, but it's totally worth it. All right, online learning. I don't think we need to talk about the pros and cons of that because you guys are living it and it kind of sucks, but it is what it is, necessary. All right, finding adult work. So obviously many emerging adults are seeking identity-based work, so something that fits who you are, and they tend to go through many different jobs looking for the right fit for their identity. They kind of drift from job to job or even flounder in their jobs. But some are really smart and systematically explore a career path, and I do suggest you do that. Don't just take your core classes, but even if it's an extra year or 2 years, take electives and figure out what you want to do with your life. Don't just, I want to be a nurse, and that's all there is to it, and I'm just taking the classes that are required to be a nurse. Take some other classes for fun and figure out what you want to do. You have the opportunity, you might as well do it. So about 50% of emerging adults in developed countries do obtain a tertiary education, so past high school. And that is important in finding a job that will pay well and then also keeping that job. So the higher your degree, the more you get paid on average, and the more likely you are to have one job your entire adulthood. So people with high school degrees usually go from job to job to job, and associates less so. If you have a bachelor's, you have even more stability in your job, and so on. If you don't have a higher education, then you're going to face a lot of disadvantages in earnings, and expectations of in your life. Your job stability, your marital stability, your health is even influenced by your education level. Okay, so those are important things to think about. But obviously, you guys are in college, so you understand that. So I won't keep harping on this. All right, I think right now we probably don't need to explain much about unemployment, except how much that could affect you. And this unemployment does prevent you from moving into the next stage of adulthood, at least in individualistic countries. You really have a hard time viewing yourself as an adult if you're unemployed or if you're not making good money. So that's why this is an important, I won't go into the details, but it is an important part of moving successfully through this stage. But I do want to point out that if you're not making money, that doesn't mean you're not an adult. And I know this is something I struggled with too, because I went through graduate school, and I didn't even get out of school until I was 27, probably 27. No wonder I started feeling like an adult at 27, because that's when I got out of school. So yeah, you are an adult. just because you're not making money doesn't mean you're an adult, and you can embrace that. So, all right, anyhow, I'm going to stop this video here, and then we'll go on.